So we are here at SCI-Arc, right?
Yep. In our Barcelona chairs.
In our Barcelona
They're
chairs.
pretty nice.
What are you writing about now?
I'm writing my Novel of Turin.
Is this the same thing we talked about when you were in La Jolla?
Probably, because I've been working on this silly thing for must be 10 years.
Okay, so it takes place in the 17th century.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about why the 17th century for a science fiction writer?
Well, when I first sort of set foot in the streets of Turin, I immediately saw that it was some kind of planned Brasilia project, it's all laid out on these kinds of angles and lines, and I thought, well, I wonder whose idea this was and what the heck they were doing. And kind of studying this city as, one of my residences, I came to realize, okay, this dates back to a time when Turin was no longer an obscure village, but actually a political capital, a kind of geographic fortified center.
Yeah.
Very careful abutments, boundaries within boundaries, a fortress and a fortress within a fortress, and abutments outside the fortress.
Borders and
border fortresses.
Yeah.
So I'm like,
this model became exported.
Yeah, well, it was imported too, because the guys there were hiring expert theorists from all over Europe. I mean, they were really dumping a lot of money at a time when then there was a lot of economic depression in the rest of Italy. But Turin was one of the few places where you could be a kind of creative intellectual and especially like an architect and actually sort of sit down and get a lot of work. So I'm like, who does this and why would they want to do it? And why would that be of interest? Well, this is kind of a tribute to a city that kind of adopted me. It's a bit like the novel Promessi Sposi by Alessandro Manzoni, which is considered the sort of founding work of Italian literature because it's one of the first ones written in a kind of literary Tuscan. But it's also about this same period in which Turin was built. It's very widescreen Baroque, and it's in the Baroque period, but it's just a very elaborate narrative with a lot of catastrophe and daring do. It's easy to imagine it as a FX spectacle. It doesn't have superheroes. I always thought that it had sort of unexploited science fictional aspects to it. It's like writing about history. Well, doing historical pastiche like steampunk is a thing that cyberpunks always thought was cute. But in this case, I'm like coming to terms with my Turin erudition. It's like, so I've spent a lot of time kind of tracking down the bits and pieces of this particular epic. And now I know what they were doing, more or less. I mean, I know it as well as sort of any other historian.
Well, one thing I remember we talked a little bit about was even you mentioned Westphalia, right? The mid-17th century is also with Treaty of Westphalia and the end of the 30 Years' War.
Yes.
There's a moment here, and we've both written about this and talked about this as sort of a bit, where there's a kind of standardization of the state geography.
Yeah.
It's like inside our box, we get one of these things.
Yes.
This is our sovereign. We get a king and a currency and a World Cup team and all the rest of this sort of things going on here as well. And when I mean that's a model that did get exported from here as well, and it's one that clearly is being liquefied and undermined. And
yeah, I think liquefied and undermined are actually well put things, because having the town flooded or barricaded, or having somebody put gunpowder mines under your city walls is a very living threat for the people of that time.
Yeah, that's not an abstraction.
And there was also like a kind of liquefaction and undermining of the pre-Westphalian order, which was, basically Christendom.
Well, that's what I mean. So the post-Westphalian looks a lot like the pre-Westphalian in some ways.
Maybe that's it, but the Westphalian thing does not really figure into my narrative as it stands. Mine is really more about a guy who's involved in urban construction.
I understand.
My hero is basically a real estate fixer.
But it has in the past. I mean, I was thinking also less when I was with reread Islands of the Net, which was a book that was one of my favorites.
That's nice to hear.
That along with Heavy Weather, which has also come back and been sort of.
I don't know why my gloomiest books are the ones that seem the most foresightful with the passage of time, but I think that's probably true of a lot of science fiction writers, actually. Since the Trump administration has begun, people quote my book Distraction a lot, because it's about a future America which is very broken down and extremely corrupt and kind of post-Soviet looking. But yes, people tend to quote the darker works probably because tragedy sticks with people better than comedy.
Going back for decades, there's been very close and sometimes not so close or clear, not so clear relationships between design and science fiction.
Right.
Both in the sense that maybe particularly within architecture of sort of imagining the future city, of the propositional model rather than the predictive model necessarily. There's sort of an arrangement back and forth. But you're someone for whom those links and those adjacencies has been much more explicit. what do people misunderstand about your interest in moving between these two worlds and these two ways of thinking about the present and the future?
I'm not sure any of that is misunderstood. I mean, people kind of get it. There aren't that many people who are actually willing to be design writers. So there's kind of design fandom, who are guys who like to talk about the objects. And then there's like design theory people who are like either academics or, former designers who just like got the philosophy bug. And then there are people who are journalists who are just like really interested in design. And I'm one of these like journalists who's really interested in design, but I also have these literary interests, futurist interests. And that's why I actually kind of contribute something to the debate as opposed to just talking about how cute designers are. I don't actually design stuff. I once designed a lamp because it was commissioned and just to prove that I could do it. The thing that I think is kind of overlooked generally about industrial design and science fiction is that they're sisters. They're born at the same time.
You say industrial design?
I say industrial design specifically.
Why so?
When the industrial design societies were first formed, it was in the 20s and 30s. And these were guys who were basically, a lot of them were Broadway set designers who just kind of drifted into doing material objects or interior decor or other kinds of stuff. And at the same time, literally kind of across town in New York, there's like guys who are like selling radio parts catalogs and decide, I could write some stories about this technology stuff and by golly, I could like get them printed. And they're both answering some kind of basic industrial need and, a kind of nascent American superpower. And they're coming from the same area and they're both using a lot of razzle-dazzle at the time. They're very into sense of wonder. And you can see that there's a certain cross-fertilization of ideas there, and some of them are making kind of glamorous super objects, and then across town they're like inventing rockets, ray guns, and robots. And the science fiction contingent goes with the gosh wow thing. And the industrial design people soon realize that the big money is in mass production.
Of these?
Small, efficient, well-produced objects. Just like, okay, science fiction never gets around to that. That's like the dull part. But they're tackling a social problem, from like different varieties. And from this historical perspective, you can see how close they are, actually.
A particular American moment where the United States is becoming a kind of global power at a particular point. It doesn't have the kind of the legacies. It's not encumbered by some of the military commitments and so
without
forth.
being a big nationalist chauvinist type, I have to tell you, it was happening in the U.S. and mostly in New York City. And there's a lot of arts and crafts guys in the kind of the Ruskin circle who are like, let everything be useful and beautiful, and they're like, trying to reformat stuff and sometimes working for industry. There's a kind of nexus of ideas and trouble that's going on at that period that they're tackling, and they're using a similar set of techniques, except industrial design goes in one direction, mostly due to grain of the material. I mean, you just can't do fantastic things and sell a lot of them.
It has the standardization. Yeah.
And and they're servants of mass consumer society, basically.
This is perhaps at the moment where industrial design gets to this moment in which it really becomes successful,
right?
At least in the American continent, in the post-war 1950s era, where it is making the standardizations. It's where quantity has become quality. Contemporary with maybe a shift towards the way in which speculative architecture had taken on some of this role. This is the heyday of.
Architecture is a lot older than industrial design or science fiction.
No, but I mean in terms of the way in which, as a design discourse and as a design imaginary, that it became to sort of be a vehicle for a kind of speculative futurism.
I got interested in industrial design mostly from a sense of shame, because I was reading sort of the industrial design text, trying to like catch up with what my new pals, the industrial designers, were into.
I see.
Because they were writing me, I wasn't writing them. Like,
how do you mean?
Well, I got like invited to the meeting of the IDSA in Nagoya. I noticed that they just stopped in the middle of the lunch and discussed the forks for like 15 minutes. And I thought, this is like a radioactive thing. I mean, these guys are like really into some kind of cultural analysis thing that I know nothing of. I'd better try to befriend them and kind of get there. So, I started reading some of the founding texts of industrial design. I immediately realized that I didn't know very much about objects, gadgets, and their affordances and how genuine objects are used within real social situations. And I also realized that most science fictional objects are really, really badly designed. And if you look at a lightsaber from an industrial design point of view, just doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's super dangerous in some ways, super useful, useless in others. It's not really a very good combat weapon. It's basically a magic wand. So, I started rethinking objects that I was inventing within science fiction and actually designing them kind of in my head. It's like, okay, what are the affordances? Like, what's the price point for this? Or just like, follow the lawsuits, It's like, how many people has this thing injured,
The risk models.
Yeah, what are the risk models for it and so forth, And immediately the tenor of these kind of invented worlds that I was working on changed really a lot.
I'm interested in this question of the risk models as a sort of way of thinking about design.
Right.
It speaks to a couple things, and maybe I'll just sort of say. One is the notion that with the risk model, which is a way in which we try to anticipate a model of the future,
right,
that risk models and the enforcement of risk models in ways in which the traditional design discourse hasn't been particularly attentive to, have had a tremendously powerful role in actually designing objects.
Yeah.
That the real designers of cars are insurance companies. That the speculative isn't something that's supplemental or secondary to the way in which the world actually works.
Right.
In this Jules Verne sense of behind the curtain, where where the sausage really gets made.
That's
the stock market is a speculative machine. I wonder, is there ways in which those of us who are interested in speculative literature and speculative design, speculative architecture, speculative systems one way or another, should be more attentive to this more foundational role for how this works?
Well, there are certain simple things you can do along that line. You could read, say, Risks to the Public in Computers and Associated Systems, which is a email newsletter put out by the Association for Computing Machinery. And, every one of those is like a potential cyberpunk thriller story. There's a kind of dialectic between people trying to outguess the risk and designing the risk away, which is like Dreyfus clean lining the Bell telephone so that it can't electrocute you. If you looked at a ladder in the United States, for instance, they're covered with bright red anti-litigation warnings, which don't prevent anybody from falling off the ladder.
No, they're warning spells.
They're warding spells. They're warding spells precisely, and they are speculative. It's like, you might fall off this ladder.
Yeah. But there's also a way in which this tries, to your point, I think this tries to capture all of the possible risks that might be associated with it in the very local sense, the local space of the object. Of course, the real risks and accidents that come with any technology are not local. They're sort of reverberate going forward.
I think you're getting into metaphysics there because,
no, I mean,
to be born is dangerous.
No, I don't mean it in a metaphysical sense. I mean it more in the really sort of the more direct sense of that Verlio's famous line that the invention of any new technology is also the invention of a new kind of accident.
Yes, that's a good one.
The invention of the light bulb is the invention of the blackout.
Yeah.
And so there's no way of capturing this risk or actually getting our arms around it because what we're making is accidents.
I mean, solving every risk just generates more risks, really.
So the question is, how do you design not against the accident, but with it?
You do it statistically. It's like, follow the blood. It's like, how do you know what to put on the front page of the newspaper? If it bleeds, it leads, And, there's a lot of risk. I mean, we're in a dreadful global climate risk right now. And we've been at it for 200 years and kind of everybody who matters knows about it. And we can't seem to engineer it away.
They accept it. We accept
they accept it, but they're worried about something else.
Right. So something is normal and something is.
I mean, some things are considered risky and bad, and others are just kind of a shoulder shrugging. Oh well, a man's got to die of something, kind of situation.
It might as well be a car crash.
Yeah, it might as well be a car crash. People love those, and it's not about the human life sacrificed. It's all about the labor costs in the transportation system. If there were robot cars that were safer, but they cost more per mile than the transports we have now, they would never be deployed. They would never deploy them. But there's never been an effort within the car business to have a Hippocratic oath. It's like, let's smash as little human flesh as possible. That's just not in the cars. It never has been.
It's never been the point of cars,
No, never been the point of cars. And cars have been around for a century. They kill more people than major wars.
Which is the point of cars.
But it's never. There's scarcely an American alive who hasn't had members of their family slaughtered on the highways or maimed for life. But it's just not part of the discourse.
So one of the things here, let's keep on the AV thing for a second.
Right.
So one of the things here at an architecture school,
Yeah.
they of course see the issue of autonomous vehicles and automation from a different perspective.
Right.
It's not the object out, it's the sort of it's the landscape in.
Yeah.
And how does the landscape reconfigure itself in relationship to things that are used to be in motion but are now
Yeah.
still, things that are still that are now in motion,
Yeah.
so forth and so on. So it seems to me, especially after the reaction to the fatality in Phoenix, given that in the same way that cars have been designed in relationship to liability,
Yeah.
the cities will be redesigned in relationship to the liability functions of the automated vehicles. And that we're likely to see more of a human exclusion zone.
Yeah.
One of the things that you've written about in terms of this territorial typology of human exclusion zones
Right.
is what you call involuntary parks.
Oh, right, yes.
And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what an involuntary park is.
Merely not having any people there is not an involuntary park. I mean, if you remove the people because the robots are too busy to put up with people underfoot, that's technically known as the black factory. And we just don't need any people around, and we don't need any lighting because we're all cuckoo robots and we're blind to begin with.
Right.
The presence of humans might be economically disadvantageous. Right. In other words, we can't afford to have people in the black factory. Whereas an involuntary park is a place that's like smashed by some kind of Anthropocenic mishap to the point where humans can't show up. So a good involuntary park is like the dividing line, the green line between Turkish Cyprus and Greek Cyprus, which is saturated with landmines and unexploded ordnance. And the UN doesn't want anybody messing around in there. And it's been growing since 1975, and nobody weeds it. So, it's this kind of this long strip of Anthropocenic, quote, wilderness, unquote. So it's a park, and nobody hunts it, and it's a sanctuary for wild animals. The ones who are there is what the Earth would look like if there were just no people around. The DMZ in Korea is one of those. The Hanford nuclear testing sites, which is like too contaminated to go, is a huge one in Georgia.
Fukushima.
Fukushima, well, it's still a ruin. It's not really a park. A park is post-natural or, re-natural or somehow like post-civilization-ish. Mankind mismanages the planet more and more severely. You get larger and larger acreages of involuntary parks, mostly for economic reasons. It just doesn't pay for people to go there. So there are a lot of areas like, say, marshy drowned zones from the seas rising, where you might just see a lot of tangled infrastructure underfoot that nobody can scrap. And everything that is human is sort of covered with this debris growth, and that would be an involuntary park.
In a strange way, there's a kind of corollary between this and what Edward O. Wilson was the half the Earth.
Yeah.
Where the idea is like, in order for the Anthropocenic ecology to actually remedy itself in some way, we'll need to consolidate people into increasingly denser megacities and let the rest of the continent sort of come back itself.
I don't know, that sounds very Rem Koolhaas. I mean, he's kind of keen on the new rural. I'm rather the Rem fan. I think he's a pretty good writer.
Yeah.
And I appreciate his interest in these kind of liminal areas.
Sure.
But there are forces that are like kind of creating these that are underestimated. You go into certain areas of Piemonte, which is where Turin is.
Yeah.
And they've got these kind of isolated little mountain villages. And you're thinking, well, that's a cool place to live. And they're like, somehow they managed it for 700 years on end, maybe 1,700, and then they just boarded it up and it's gone, right? And you're like, why? I mean, there's like plenty of people in Italy. I mean, it's not like nobody ever wanted to live in such a place. And, often it's even like strikingly beautiful, I got a book on Piemonte's ghost towns. There's enough of them to fill a book. Not that anybody beat them up, there were no massacres. They just kind of left.
It wasn't pushed out. It wasn't.
Yeah, they left
right.
for, peculiar mixes of ecological, economic, and just isolation, which is sort of no longer in vogue, I mean, they're complicated situations, but you do see them, and you see them in like weird areas that you don't expect. And
so let me ask you a little bit, a couple things I wanted to talk, I had some questions around the new aesthetic stuff that you had written about James's original thing.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about what the new aesthetic meant at that particular moment, and
right.
Because you mentioned the AI, you mentioned some of these questions of the machine vision of this as well.
Right.
I don't know if it seems so new anymore. I guess maybe that this is just what we call aesthetics.
I was very excited to see James do his new aesthetic pitch at South by Southwest Interactive, which is a place where I always go. And when I heard him talking about it, I immediately realized that it was a thing of a lot of personal relevance to me. And he says, well, wait a minute, if you're looking for originality, it's all these machine-generated and algorithmic things, and just look at all these glitches, and it's like, this thing looks incredibly weird. It's like no human being could ever make that. It's right under your nose. Why don't you recognize that it's like a valid part of today's aesthetic environment? And I'm like, that's great. It's like, because I see tons of this stuff, and it's like, all I need is an actual aesthetic doctrine, which enables me to say, this form of machine-generated art is better than this other one.
We need this.
You can, but you need to actually have an aesthetic. You need a metaphysics before you can have the aesthetic, but you actually need a new aesthetic.
Yeah,
right?
I follow.
So it's like, okay, we've got these machine generation art systems, and it's like, how do we tackle them as critics? It's like, how do we reward their creators? How do we know which ones to put in the canon? Why do they belong in the gallery? Why would we devote attention to one instead of think of the other one as a gimmick or something that can be forgotten?
I follow. I think the ways in which that we might take this and put it into an aesthetic register, that we could make some of these kinds of Ruskin sets of value judgments and find these things as well.
Well, we can't use Ruskin's sense of value, but we have to have sort of the moral seriousness of Ruskin and coming up to it. We actually need a new aesthetic, and we need a new vocabulary of why these, what do they mean to us? What are we trying to achieve through these methods of expression? So, I was super impressed, to see James Bratton bring this up, and he's been a very active artist. He's been producing a lot of stuff. I'm super interested in his career, and I take the people seriously that he takes seriously. I think he's actually a pretty good critic, but I also feel we haven't fulfilled the promise of this, and that we haven't really brought in the heavy artillery of artistic criticism. One
of the other things I wanted to ask you a little bit about, which goes back to some of the discussion that we had a little bit earlier about the role of risk models.
Right.
As an infrastructural form of speculation, or infrastructural futurism in various ways. And one of the terms you've used a lot recently is what you call the uninsurability of particular sort of ways.
Yes.
So, we don't usually think of insurance as a kind of applied futurism, but of course it is. If I told you...
Just look at the insurance mortality tables.
Yeah. So tell us, what do you mean by uninsurability, and what do you think that does this connect in some way to some of the ways in which we feel perhaps a lot less certain, not just about what the future is, but whether there even is one to know?
Well, I think uninsurability, or the insurance system, stands in as a proxy for the property system. So, there are a lot of architectural developments where you just can't go there if you don't have insurance. And then there's a lot of hidden underwriting or kind of boosting. The American population in general pays absurd amounts of money to protect coastal properties.
The implication then is that the accountability for the accidents that ensue is less.
Well, the implication is the favela, because favela is an area where there's a lot of people alive and they're very busy and doing all kinds of stuff. They just don't have any legal rights to the ground on which they're squatting.
It doesn't have certain futures.
Well, there's a lot of favelas, and my feeling is there's going to be more, right? Probably a lot of these uninsurable zones and the rims of these involuntary parks will be favela-like. A destruction of the physical infrastructure because you can't get the legal and financial backing to pin it in place.
So we're talking 2018. We look back at the literature from 1918.
Yes.
And the number of times in which the year 2000 or the 21st century is invoked and imagined and conjured and used as a rationale or justification or promise for whatever's going on in this present moment is pervasive in the fiction and nonfiction at the same time. In 2018, the number of times you hear people using the term the 22nd century,
they're not around much.
You don't hear this very much. What is that symptomatic of?
It's short-termism in some ways. It's the singularity in others. There's just this narrative of, the kind of blooming Moore's law, where we're going to continue to pull digital rabbits out of the hat until the world is unrecognizable. So I think that was actually part of the problem. I think it was part of the kind of Silicon Valley boom. But we're now in an era of industry consolidation in Silicon Valley, and also these ethno-national regimes around the world do not care about their globalizing ethos. On the contrary, they're very into nationalistic cyberspaces. And to see the cyberspace of the 1980s, which was a sort of booming, blooming, consensual hallucination, becoming a tool of ethno-nationalism a little later is a very interesting signifier, sort of like closes that era with an oxymoron. We're gonna see that instead of like this ever-expanding Moore's law of fantastic electro worlds, that we actually have this epic struggle of clashing semi-national, semi-post-national organizational empires. At that point, I think there's going to be kind of a new sobriety about it. It'll be grim in some ways because there's a lot of environmental decline and a certain amount of clash of civilization stuff going on. But there's also just like the death of the cyberspace age being like the death of the space age or the death of the atomic age is like a period of reassessment when you realize, wait a minute, we're not have energy free, too cheap to meter. We're not going to settle the entire solar system and be on Mars and Venus. We've built like this huge thing, and it's like the new industrial order that we have, but we still got to get up in the morning. I mean, somebody's got to like water the roses and feed the cat, and from that point of view, I'm thinking a group of people will start talking about the 22nd century, and I don't know what they'll be, political activists, architects maybe, that would be good.
We're not good at this.
We're not good at it. That doesn't mean that nobody could ever be good at it.
Yeah, of course.
Right? And if you had a temperament that sort of said, well, the water is going to rise for 30 years, and, with any kind of luck, we'll turn it around somewhere in 2070. When William Gibson and I complain that nobody talks about the 22nd century, we don't say that they ought to have a positive attitude about it, right? It's more like, it's kind of dumb of us not to think about it, but in some ways we were blinded by our own razzmatazz, and now that this particular cultural era is stumbling over its own unplugged cords, it opens up new possibilities for speculation, really, and also new possibilities for action.
Es que dejamos las preguntas que hacen, es que tenemos que saber